So your chapter 24, Origin of the Species. The big concept of this chapter is, how do species come about? What does it mean to be a species? And, basically how do species evolve? And so a general overview of that. All right, so with that. So the term speciation. Speciation is going to be the process by which one species splits into two or more species. It's at the focal point of the evolutionary theory. So really with this, to understand evolution and how throughout time different species have evolved, you have to really understand the speciation process. So with that, we talk about something called microevolution versus macroevolution. And so your microevolution, that is going to consist of changes in allele frequencies. So when we're talking about allele frequencies, literally we are looking at the alleles that are on the chromosomes. And so we are looking at the changes of allele frequencies within a population. And so when we're talking about macroevolution, macroevolution is going to refer to broad patterns of evolutionary change above the species level. So when we're looking at, when you're looking at fossils don't usually, now that we are getting more DNA evidence and support and finding more organisms that have been preserved better, that is changing a little bit. But normally when we look at fossils, we are really referring to the phylum level. We're not referring to the species level. Okay, like I said, that's not set in stone, no pun intended. All righty, so with that, speciation forms basically that conceptual bridge between microevolution, looking at the frequency changing of alleles, and macroevolution, which is above that species level. And so species is going to be a Latin word meaning kind or appearance. So your biologists, they're going to compare morphologically, physiologically, biochemistry, and now DNA sequencing. So before DNA sequencing, trying to figure out species was very much the morphological, physiological biochemistry. And so also something that they haven't put in there is also ecological. Ecological is also kept in mind. And so when we talk about the biological species concept, by the way, this is something that you absolutely need to know for your test. Biological species concept states that a species is a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. They do not produce successfully with members of other groups. Okay, so they do not breed successfully with members in other groups. So gene flow between populations is going to hold a species together genetically. It's going to connect a species genetically. So I'm going to go back to your biological species concept and just really iterate that it is a population whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature. Okay, they produce viable, fertile offspring. So with that, in the biological species concept, we like to keep some of those morphological and physiological things in mind also. But let's look here. You can see these two birds. These two birds look very, very similar. Morphologically, you would look at them and be like, oh, they're the same species, but they are not. They're actually two different species. So between different species, you might find similarities that morphologically you can right away assume that these are two of the same species. Versus on the flip side, you have also diversity within a species. So all of these individuals that morphologically and have different physiological traits also, you can see not completely different traits, but they have some different traits. you can see differences. Okay. So there's also diversity within a species. These are all humans. These are all Homo sapiens. So with that, even within a species, you can find differences. So let's start talking about some reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is going to be the existence of biological factors, which are going to be barriers. Those barriers impede two species from producing viable, fertile offspring. Viable means that they are going to live to their fullest from a juvenile state into a grown-up state. So viable, fertile offspring. And so hybrids are going to be offspring that result from mating between two different species. Sometimes hybrids can fit this definition and be viable and fertile, but a lot of times they cannot. So reproductive isolation can be classified whether factors act, whether before or after fertilization. So in reproductive isolation, it's all about, can the product be viable and fertile? So what could have reproductive isolation? We have these two sections, two large sections, and then they're sectioned off: pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers. So these pre-zygotic barriers, these are barriers that are going to keep a zygote from being formed, meaning when the sperm come together with the egg, if it ever gets there, a zygote is formed. So these kind of barriers take place before a zygote gets born, a zygote gets produced, excuse me. So post-zygotic barriers. This is going to happen after a zygote is produced, but they are barriers that keep viable, fertile offspring from being the result. So let's do the pre-zygotic barriers first. Those pre-zygotic barriers, they are going to block fertilization from even occurring. And so they will impede different species from attempting mating. They will prevent the successful completion of mating. They will hinder fertilization if mating is successful. So it could be any of those things. It could be a combination of those things, but really individually probably. So if you see individuals of two different species, right here, say you have a gamete from one species and another gamete from another species, they're trying to get together. So habitat isolation, temporal isolation, and behavioral isolation. Those things are going to keep individuals of different species from mating. If they can get beyond these barriers, then there can be a mating attempt. So for example of habitat isolation, two species encounter each other very rarely or not at all because they occupy different habitats. Even though they're not isolated by physical barriers, they're not in the same place at the same time. So because they're not in the same place at the same time, we would essentially say they are that is a reproductive isolation, a pre-zygotic barrier. So these flies, this fly has one habitat and this fly has a different habitat. This one hangs out on hawthorns and apples, and this one hangs out on blueberries. Because they're never in the same place at the same time, they're never going to get together to mate. I can use an example of this of a tiger and a lion. We talked about this at our last meeting. A tiger and a lion live in two different habitats. In nature, they're not going to meet. So that is a pre-zygotic barrier. So temporal isolation. So in temporal isolation, species will breed at different times of the day, different seasons of the year, or even completely different years. And so because of that, because they are disinterested in breeding at the same time, they're never going to get together to put their gametes together to mate. Okay, so this is an example of two different skunks. One of these skunk is a temporal, one of these skunks is going to want to breed in the summer. The other one wants to breed in the winter. So they're isolated. There are some organisms, for example, that they're active during the day, being diurnal, And then some are active at night, being nocturnal. Because of that, while one's out and moving around, the other one's asleep, and vice versa. And so they're not going to meet. So that would be also another example of temporal isolation. Here's an example of behavioral isolation. This has to be one of my favorite. Birds are so guilty of this. It is behavioral isolation. And so you will see courtship between different species of birds being specific to those species of birds. And so what you're looking at here, you're looking at a blue-footed booby. This blue-footed booby does a funky little dance. Birds love to do dances, but the thing about the blue-footed booby, his dance is special to the female blue-footed booby. And because of that, other birds might look at this blue-footed booby and be like, what's up there with that strange dance? But when the female blue-footed booby sees the male blue-footed booby's dance, she's like, oh, look at his moves. I love the way he dances. So that's a behavioral isolation because that dance is specific to their species. And other species, they don't really dig it the same way. So next, other pre-zygotic barriers, mechanical isolation and gametic isolation. Mechanical isolation is exactly how it sounds. They have different morphology that prevents successful completion of mating. What you're looking at is you are looking at two snails. So the thing about these two snails, so snails, you're going to find it in slugs too. They are hermaphroditic, meaning they both have female and male parts. And then so when they mate, I'm talking specifically about some slugs. I'll go to these snails here in a minute since I already started my slug. When they mate, they will line up just perfectly where their male parts and their female parts will line up at the same time. So one male part will line up to the other one's female part, and that male part will line up to the first one's female part. And they will simultaneously mate with each other, and they both leave pregnant, okay? So if they were different species, you would find that their male and female parts don't line up exactly the way they're supposed to. And so that could be a mechanical isolation. So these snails, this is a mechanical isolation because you are finding out also that if they're different species, that their male and female parts are not lining up. So the next one, gametic isolation. So you can have all of these different sea urchins. And for you, you might look at them and be like, oh, they're sea urchins. Why? They're just different colors. Why would they not be able to successfully mate? Well, they may be able to release the sperm, and the other sea urchin will get their egg trying to be fertilized, and the sperm might actually make way to the egg. But what is going to separate them is usually going to be the chromosomal number, okay? One of the species has a different chromosomal number than the other species. So even if the sperm does get into the egg and attempt fertilization, because it is a different chromosomal number, a gamete will not get made. Excuse me. Just a drink of water. Okay, so next, post-zygotic barriers. These post-zygotic barriers means a zygote was made. The fertilization was successful. So that's what you're seeing here. The fertilization was successful. Now, the organism or the zygote needs to be able to get past all of these barriers and have viable fertile offspring in order to be considered its own species. So post-zygotic barriers prevent the hybrid zygote from developing into that viable fertile offspring. So number one, they reduce their hybrid viability, okay? Reduce the fertility. And last but not least, there's something called hybrid breakdown. So we've reduced hybrid viability. genes of different parent species may interact and impair the hybrid's development. So if you have two different organisms from two different species, and they are able to make a successful zygote, as that zygote grows up, you might find that genes from one of the individual species basically hinders the ability for other genes to produce the phenotype that is going to help that organism be successful. And so basically, it's going to keep that hybrid from being successful, and it's probably going to die. So, reduced hybrid fertility. So even if the hybrids are vigorous, meaning that they grew up well, they can live well themselves, they may be sterile. So what we're looking at here, we talked about this at our last meeting. You have a horse and you have a donkey. When you have a horse and a donkey, they are two different species. They come together, they go ahead and mate, and you get yourself a mule. Well, a mule is sterile. So because a mule is sterile, in order to get more mules, you got to get more horses and more donkeys together. So you would consider a mule a hybrid, but you would not consider a mule its own viable, fertile species. It is viable, but it's not fertile. So it's not considered its own species. It is stuck in that hybrid zone. So hybrid breakdown. So some first generation hybrids are fertile, but when they mate with each other or with the parent species, the offspring of the next generation are feeble or sterile. So basically, if you're able to get through the first two post-zygotic barriers about being able to live well in life and then also being fertile, if your offspring can't do it, then you would not consider this a successful species. It would just be a hybrid. They call that hybrid breakdown. So this is the breakdown right here. So the limitations of the biological species concept. And so the biological species concept cannot be applied to fossils, cannot be applied to asexual organisms. Why? Because they're not mating with each other. They are just producing clones of themselves. So that includes all prokaryotes and some eukaryotes. So that biological, as long as those eukaryotes do not also have the ability to sexually reproduce. I should add on to that. So the biological species concept is going to emphasize, it's going to be emphasized in absence of gene flow. So meaning gene flow can occur between morphological and ecological distinct species. But it doesn't mean that just because gene flow happens and your offspring are viable and fertile doesn't really mean that they are making a new species. Perfect example is your growler bear. So this right here, this is your grizzly bear, and here's your polar bear. They can get together, and they have gotten together in the wild, and they make what is called a hybrid called the growler bear. So essentially, they really should be ecologically separated, but because of the changing environment, you are finding that their regions, their ranges are now crossing over. So now you are getting more growler bears. But the problem with that, having more growler bears, is that it's almost like I don't even know how to explain it. It's like a personal confusion. They have one instinct to act and eat and hunt one way, but they also have this other instinct to act and eat and hunt a different way. And so on top of that too, they look very different. So because they look very different, they're not necessarily attractive to either species. And so both species kind of look at it like, you don't look right. And so it also inhibits their ability to be successful in the wild. Okay, so other definitions of species. And so other definitions, other species concepts will emphasize a unity within a species rather than the separateness, that diversity of the species. And so start with the morphological species concept. Number one, the morphological species concept is going to define a species by structural features. So before DNA, this is a huge thing that we would look at when trying to determine different species, the morphological species concept. It applies to both sexual and asexual species, but it relies on specific criteria for those species. Like, what would you expect this species to look like? So we're looking at its anatomical structures. When we talk about the ecological species concept, we've already tipped into this a little bit, but your ecological species concept defines a species in terms of its ecological niche. So it also applies to sexual and asexual species and emphasizes the role of disruptive selection. And so with many species, we went over disruptive selection in our previous chapter. And so with many species, definitions have been proposed. And so the usefulness of each of them depends on the situation in which those questions are being asked. So when we're talking about the disruptive selection, basically ecologically, you're going to have one organism on one area and then another organism in another area. I feel like I keep going back to the lion and the tiger. So the lion and the tiger, they have their own ecological niches. And so suppose one day that those niches ever crossed and they ever were to, in nature, have some babies, right? In that disruptive selection, you are still going to find a bulk of most of them being tigers and most of them being lions, and very little of them being the hybrid in between, at least at this point in their area of ecological, where they fall, where their niches are. So when speciation takes place, it can take place with or without geographic separation, okay? So when we say it takes place, allopatric speciation, this means there is a geographical separation. And because of that geographical separation, it is going to lead to speciation. So look down here. So once upon a time, you had these fish that were in this pond. And then eventually they were able to basically go back and forth between the pond. And this was keeping gene flow constant around that pond. But then the water levels dropped. And when those water levels dropped, it separated them. This is a geographical separation. So that's what allopatric is, a geographical separation. And so then what happened is the species that were left in this pond, given enough time, they ended up having mutations, and accumulations of mutations led them to being sexually isolated, meaning that they eventually evolved genes that they were having those either pre or post-zygotic barriers, leading to that speciation. And this one, it looks like they kept the original species, or they could have also speciated more too. Sympatric, just think same Patrick. It's not really same Patrick, it's sympatric speciation, meaning that you don't have a geographical separation. Right here, they're able to still have gene flow back and forth and back and forth. But due to genetic mutation in some of the fish, see these blue ones here? Genetic mutation in some of those fish, that actually caused those fish to be so different that they were no longer sexually compatible or zygote compatible or morphologically compatible with the other fish. Thereby, they ended up speciating into a new species. So in allopatric speciation, like I said before, this is just a repeat of what I said, gene flow is interrupted. And since that gene flow is interrupted, that can cause the populations in those two separate places to isolate and make subpopulations. And so another example is the flightless bird, cormorant of the Galapagos, is likely originated from the flying species from the mainland. But what happened, the flying species from the mainland found those archipelago islands, found a niche on those islands, and didn't have a need to return to the mainland. So while at those islands throughout time, eventually speciated into their own species. But they did have a geographical separation, being that they found their own island. So the definition of barrier depends on the ability of the population to disperse. Officially, those were flightless birds, so they're stuck there unless they hopped on some driftwood and went back to the other island, right? So those flying species that went onto the island evolved into the flightless species. Well, flightless species is stuck there. So sorry if I didn't bring that home the first time I said that. So depending on the barrier and the ability for the population to disperse, we've actually talked about this in our previous chapters too. I talked about as far as the fence along I-25. And so here's another example. A canyon could create a barrier for small rodents, okay? Because for small rodents, they are not going to travel way across the canyon. They're going to stay in an area that is close to their home. That way they can get their food and go underground quickly. Otherwise, they're going to end up having to find just a new home to go to. But if they got small babies at home to feed, they're not going to do that. And so birds are not, they're not separated by this. Birds can fly anywhere. They can go where they need to go. Coyotes travel further. Pollen uses wind to travel. Some pollen uses wind to travel. Some pollen use insects to travel. And so those right there, you would not consider barriers because they do have that ability just to disperse. So in the process of allopatric speciation, you are going to have, like I said, those separated populations evolving independently through mutation. Mutation is at the level of the genetics, and it is happenstance. It just happens, okay? Natural selection. So those genes are going to produce new phenotypes, new proteins that produce those new phenotypes. And nature is going to select upon the phenotypes, okay? And genetic drift, if you recall from the previous chapter, is just random chance. It is different than natural selection. It is just a matter of who in the population is going to get the opportunity to pass on its alleles to the next generation. Not everybody gets to have the babies and pass on their alleles to the next generation. All righty, so with that, reproductive isolation may arise as a byproduct of genetic divergence. And so, for example, isolated populations of mosquito fish, they have become reproductively isolated as a result of selection under different levels of predation. And so with predators, the body shape that enables rapid bursts of speed, okay? So this fish has basically evolved a body shape that allows it to get away from predators. And in this area where it lives, lots of different predators, specific predators to it. In the evolution of it not having a lot of predators, you're going to see a different body shape taking place. And that body shape is going to favor long, steady swimming. So that long, steady swimming is so it can get its food, it can go where it needs to go. And so rapid burst of speed versus long, steady speed. And that is literally how evolution can take place under specific pressures within an ecosystem. So the evidence of allopatric speciation. So regions with different geographic barriers will typically have more species than regions with fewer barriers. Okay, so you're going to see speciation take place more if you have a lot of different geographical issues going on, whether it's valleys, fences, like I showed you with the pond losing water and separating ponds. And then reproductive isolation between the populations will generally increase as the distance between them increases. So if you have animals, like let's go ahead and say birds. Birds say they're reproductively isolated, meaning that you have a bird in one city and a bird in another city that is 400 miles away. Well, the further away it is, the more reproductively isolated that population is. Not all birds are like geese and just like to go for a long distance fly. Okay, some still like to keep it close. So it really depends on those species too. So the reproductive barriers are going to be intrinsic to those organisms themselves. So the physical separation is not the only biological barrier. Like I said, different individuals can reproductively isolate themselves according to their interests, their needs, their niches, predators and such. All righty, so let's do some sympatric speciation. In sympatric speciation, same country, that's what that means. So sympatric speciation occurs when in populations that live in the same geographical area. So it can occur if gene flow is reduced by factors. Those factors could be polyploidy, sexual selection, and habitat differentiation. What is polyploidy? Hang on, I gotta mute so I can cough. Sorry about that. Okay, what is polyploidy? It is the presence of extra sets of chromosomes due to accidents during cell division. Okay, so if you recall from your Bio 111, you have cases of haploid, you have cases of diploid. So hap is just one set of chromosomes. Diploid are two sets of chromosomes. Polyploid are three or more sets of chromosomes. Okay, so polyploidy is much more common in plants than it is in animals. Polyploidy can produce new biological species in sympatry with a single generation, within one generation, excuse me. So this is a continuation of explaining your polyploidy. So specifically, autopolyploidy. That is an individual with more than two sets of chromosomes derived from a single species. So if you look at this diploid cell, this diploid cell is 6, meaning it's got two pair of 3 different chromosomes. Count them up: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, the haploid of that cell would be 3. So if that kind of takes you back to your chapter 12 and chapter 13. So anyway, because of a cell division error, you end up with a tetraploid cell, which is 4N. So let's look here. It means that that during cell division on specifically the anaphase of cell division, these chromosomes did not separate like they were supposed to. So when you started out with a cell of 6, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 chromosomes, now you're going to have a cell of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 chromosomes. So basically it doubled it. And so you end up with what is called a tetraploid cell. And so this tetraploid cell, as it goes through meiosis, this individual goes through meiosis. That first round is going to be 2N and 2N. And you end up with your gametes being produced by tetraploids. So if you recall in your chapter 13, after meiosis 1, it should be halving its number. At the end of meiosis 2, it should be a haploid number. But this one is not. It is not becoming a haploid number. It's a diploid number. And so that means it's got more than it should. So if these gametes were to go and produce a cell, it's going to form a new species. And so you put them together, your new species is a tetraploid species. And you're probably over here trying to imagine what animal looks like that, what human looks like that. So with this is really a situation that happens more with plants. Okay, plants are usually the culprits for these guys. And so the offspring resulting from mating between polyploids and diploids, they usually have reduced fertility. Okay, so they're usually just not the best. And so that was a case of autopolyploidy. This is allopolyploidy. Allopolyploidy is when a species with multiple sets of chromosomes is derived from different species. So it's not a case of one species being the culprit. It's more than one species coming together and mating. So allopolyploids can be successful. They can successfully mate with one each other, but they cannot interbreed with either parent